Oui, bonjour. To start the introduction, as you can see, I'm not Daniel Weinstock. Daniel was supposed to do the introduction to the book launch, but for personal matter, he cannot be with us today. So I have the pleasure to do this. I'm professor at the School of Public Health at Montreal University. I be brief, welcome and thank you to be here. I'm introducing the book launch on behalf of my colleague, Catherine Régis, Daniel Weinstock, and Clara Champagne. And as you know, the book was a collective enterprise. So first, I want to thank you all the contributors. We have more than 30 contributors to the book. 17 chapter, and in the kind of unusual situation, all the chapter arrive on time, which is not usual in this kind of academic adventure. So the basic idea behind the book is very simple. Like in April 2020, we start to have a very informal discussion, and we conclude, and this is not a revelation to all of you, that the pandemic was somewhat of an unusual and transformative time without knowing exactly what it would mean in the long run. So to start to explore some of the consequences of the pandemic on main aspect of social life and social institution, we approached colleagues from different disciplines. And as you can see, the book cover aspect like nightlife up to the role of science in government, and up to responsible innovation and human rights. So it's a broad spectrum of consideration. And we ask contributors to produce a kind of reflexive and prospective essay based on their domain of expertise. And some of them will share with us their insight and some further thinking since they wrote their chapter. So the program is divided in 3 panels. The first panel is pandemic and post-pandemic life. We hope that the post-pandemic will arrive sometime soon. Then the second panel is on government, public policy, relation between government and science. And the third panel is on health and health institution and system. So without further remarks, I will pass the floor to Clara. Clara, I've accepted to moderate the first panel at the last minute. It was supposed to be Daniel, so thank you for this, Clara. And as you became aware all along the process of producing the book, beyond being co-author of a chapter, Clara played a very important role to make this possible and arrive in good shape in the end. And she's currently a PhD student in communication at Montreal University. Clara, your turn.
Merci, Jean-Louis. So panelists of panel 1, you can turn on your camera and all right, so thank you for being with us today. Welcome to the first panel on pandemic and post-pandemic life. So for the first panel, we have 5 co-authors of Pandemic Societies with us. So Will Straw and Jess Rhea will be talking to us about their chapter, Nightlife in a Pandemic. Dr. Straw is James McGill Professor of Urban Media Studies at McGill University, where he teaches within the Department of Art History and Communication Sciences. He is the author and editor of multiple books, including recently the Oxford Handbook of Canadian Cinema. Dr. Jess Rhea is Assistant Professor at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. Dr. Rhea was previously a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University. Their areas of research include science and technology studies, Critical Data Studies, Intellectual Property, Urban Governance, and Night Studies. Next up, we have Dr. Eric Lewis, who will be talking to us about his chapter, A Gateway Between One World and the Next, Performance-Based Arts in COVID Times. Dr. Lewis is a professor of philosophy and associate member of the Department of Music Research at McGill. He is the author recently of Intents and Purposes, Philosophy and the Aesthetics of Improvisation. Dr. Quill Kukla will present their chapter, The COVID-19 Pandemic and the Loss of the Urban. Dr. Kukla is professor of philosophy at Georgetown University and senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Dr. Kukla recently published City Living, How Urban Spaces and Urban Dwellers Make One Another. And finally, we have Dr. Tania Saba, who is a full professor at the School of Industrial Relations at the University of Montreal, where she holds the BMO chair in diversity and governance. She has published extensively on diversity management, workforce aging, intergenerational value differences, knowledge transfer, and work organization. As for myself, I was the project coordinator for Pandemic Societies, so it's my first time seeing all of you, but we've talked quite a lot through email. And as you may have noticed, I am not Daniel. So I will be moderating the first panel today instead of Daniel, and it's my first time doing this, and Daniel has pretty big shoes to fill, so I hope I'll make him proud. So here's how this panel will work. You will all present your chapters of what you wrote about in Pandemic Societies, and then we will have a discussion. I have prepared some questions, and we will also be taking questions from the Q&A. So for people watching, if you have any questions for our panelists, the floor will be open to you. So who wants to start? Jess and Will, do you want to start?
Sure. Do you want to go first, Jess, or do you want me to? Okay, this corresponds to the article where I sort of did more of the intro and she did a big part of the rest. So our chapter is on nightlife in a pandemic, night in a pandemic. Both Dr. Ray and I identify, at least in part of our work, with this emerging field that you've never heard of called night studies. Believe me, it's there. It's taking off. And the first thing I would say is that I'll quote the Prime Minister of Italy, who in March 20th, 2020, used the phrase, no more nightlife, that there will be no more nightlife. It has become customary since the pandemic began to say that nightlife, the culture of the night, was the first victim of the pandemic. I mean, obviously there were people who died and so on who were the real first victims, but that the primary cultural victim perhaps was that. As someone who watched the pandemic unfold, I remember in February 2020, watching a video called Taking the Mosh Pit Online about Chinese punks moving their music into online platforms, and then a video from the same month about night cleaners disinfecting the deserted city of Luoyang in China in the pandemic. And this is, of course, before we thought that it had come to where we live in Canada. The main points I would say of part of the chapter are that if COVID produced a crisis of nightlife, this was a crisis that was already being diagnosed and responded to for at least 2 or 3 years before that. Gentrification, in particular, had resulted in many venues of nightlife culture being closed, rising rents and things like that. And one effect of this is that organizations had already sort of been put in place or come into being to deal with this. The concept of night governance that Dr. Rea will presumably speak about very soon, that you have night mayors, night czars, night officers in cities for 4 or 5 years before the pandemic had gotten a lot of momentum. So COVID arrived in a context in which there was already, in certain sectors, a great deal of reflection upon the culture of the night, how it can be governed, how it can be preserved, how it can be developed, and so on. And I'll just say, before passing things over to Dr. Rea, that from March 2020 onwards, or at least as far onwards as we got before we wrote our chapters, there were, to me at least, two phases in the development of international nightlife. One was the quick attempt to think of ways in which nightlife, especially the musical culture of nightlife, could be put online. April 2020, you already have a club in Los Angeles, The Zone, claiming that it's the first online nightclub. You have DJs streaming from Berlin. But by the summer of 2020, at least in the global north, the thinking came to be much more about cities. What elements of the new urbanism, pedestrian streets, neighborhood kind of performance and entertainment venues, outdoor entertainment, all of these things that were responses to COVID's restrictions were also about reimagining the parts of cities. And so that became a very interesting thing as well. I'll simply say that I've never been so overstimulated in my academic career, which now is almost 40 years, than during the pandemic, where I was in touch with so many people working on and thinking about the things I was interested in. And so despite all the kind of horrors and disappointments and injustices, it was a very exciting time. I'll turn it over to you now, Jess.
Thanks, Clara, and thanks, Will, for this. I can talk a little bit about our case studies. We decided to look at Montreal since both Will and I were pretty much involved in many activities and things going on in the moment, which, as I will briefly show you, was like a fascinating moment for nightlife under curfew. And we were like thinking and discussing, meeting with all these people around the world to discuss nightlife and the impacts that the pandemic would have in nighttime economy worldwide. So in Montreal is an interesting case studies for us because we describe it to connected process. On one hand, how the local government managed to establish mechanisms of nightlife governance during a pandemic. And on the other hand, we also saw how advocates for nightlife were able to participate in this process, like in a dialogue with the local government, and also create the first independent night council in the city of Montreal in 2020. So we saw all this happening in a moment of uncertainty while nightlife was shutting down everywhere, as Will mentioned just now. So it was quite fascinating, and I'm glad we were there to experience and contributed to all these processes. And we wrote this chapter as researchers, but also as people who were actively participating in creating this nightlife policy for the city. And so it kept us busy during very long months of isolation, curfew, and winter in Montreal. And Montreal has been known for its vibrant nightlife for over a century, but it was a little bit behind any other major cities like Amsterdam, Berlin, some cities in the US, and some cities in Latin America as well, Sydney, Australia, when it came to create this kind of mechanism to understand, measure, regulate, police night, like the city after dark. So many conflicts existed already, and they were exacerbated by the pandemic for sure, because before we had noise complaints, that's a huge thing in Montreal, and also like a very, very complex regulatory framework. If anyone here already tried to get a permit of any kind in Montreal, you probably know how hard that can be to navigate, like the administrative system in the city. So the pandemic kind of like shed light on all those things. Some small music venues that were already struggling shut down, and we saw like all sorts of bars and small business turning from nightclubs to retail stores, like historic places in the city, kind of like trying to adapt and shape-shifting to keep afloat during the pandemic. And so in the spring and summer, we saw some big changes and developments in terms of nightlife governance. Montreal 24-24, Montreal 24-24, this nonprofit organization created the first night council, Le Conseil de Nuit, with 12 members from different areas and sectors, like cultural sectors in the city. And the city of Montreal also appointed its first commissioner of noise and night. It's the equivalent of a night mayor. We don't have like a formal night mayor in Montreal, but it can be considered like an equivalent. And Deborah Delaney, who is connected to the economic development department, and she started like this entire collaborative process to design the first nightlife policy in Montreal. And Will and I were lucky to be part of that, so I could contribute to this. I'm part of the Night Council. My mandate ends this year. So we could like actively be there and report those things, include those things in our chapter. So since then we had night summits online mostly, and all sorts of meetings and pilot projects coming up. And we live it's hard to believe that we live it for 5 months under curfew in Quebec. And it's even harder to believe that we just left another curfew last week. So I think this was very, very important to us as researchers, and also like to contribute to policy and city life. And things are changing a lot. So we could, as we said, like write an entire different chapter today if you would look back to this topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Jess and Will. Eric, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I do want to start by thanking the editors and everyone associated with this volume, and particularly Clara, who was the point person with all the authors, and I'm sure dealing with a large number of what could be cranky authors. Maybe if this is just autobiography, could not have always been fun, and I thank you for shepherding this through. I also remember talking to Daniel Weinstock, late in the stages, when he said, you know, we in the press are doing everything we can to have this book come out while it's still relevant. Be careful what you ask for, I think, is the moral of that story. Here we are. My chapter was written with my colleague and friend Christos Karas, who's the artistic director of the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens, which is the cultural wing of the Onassis Foundation. He just could not join us today because of other commitments. And our chapter overlaps with a number of the concerns of Will and Jess's chapter. We were tasked to look at performance under COVID. And our chapter, you know, looked at two things. Of course, performance spaces were among the very first things to close down. This had knock-on effects, venues, artists, fulfilling obligations to grants, putting food on the table for folks who are, you know, in this world. And we consider two things in the chapter. On the one hand, how artists, institutions, venues, organizations, and governments pivoted to attempt to move primarily into the digital domain in many ways. A number of these things are very jurisdiction specific. If I had to make a one-sentence summary of what it was like in Quebec, if one was able to navigate the kinds of regulations and paperwork, there's a sense in which vast amounts of money were thrown actually at venues and artists, but the caveat of needing ability to access them is an important one. So we also wanted to look at the kind of opportunities that moving to the digital domain, which is primarily what the performance world did. And we focused on at least 4 categories of opportunities. One is accessibility. How, while there are, of course, barriers to accessing the digital domain, obvious ones like needing to have a computer and a stable internet connection, it also opened up performance spaces both to audience members and performers who, for any number of reasons, spatial proximity or the inability to access certain kinds of spaces, were now able to do so. One of the most important spaces for new and creative musics in Montreal, the Sala Rosa, is historically not wheelchair accessible. I have spent any number of nights literally carrying wheelchairs up the stairs. You lose those kinds of issues. We were looking at issues of intimacy. We often think of digital mediated encounters as being less intimate. And of course, there are certain ways in which they obviously are. But we interviewed people who teach, say, private music lessons with children who have disabilities, and suddenly were given access to their world and aspects of their subjectivity which they otherwise were not able to access. And they found this to be quite quite intimate and important for the growth of their relationship. Collaboration in the artistic world is a big area where COVID has raised opportunities. Folks who have wanted to collaborate together, but they may have been in one in Montevideo and one in Montreal, and prior to COVID, you'd be waiting for that opportunity. When can I get there? Will we both be in Berlin next August? Now people said, well, let's just do it. We're going to do it in telematically. We're going to collaborate in the digital domain. And there has been a real growth of collaborations that cross traditional boundaries and territories. And also the way artists have used the potentials of the digital domain in their art, everything from incorporating multimedia, avatars, virtual reality. We've seen a real growth of artists who may not historically have leveraged the digital in their art practices, experimenting with it and taking it on. So we sort of were looking both at the problems and the opportunities. I would say, to fast forward to the present, as we all know, a certain kind of Zoom fatigue has set in with many of us at the exact same time where many institutions, particularly smaller and medium-sized performance spaces, finally got funding and technology in place for high-quality telematics, is the same time now that a lot of us are like, oh no, not another Zoom concert. And what we suspect is going to become permanent is digital streaming and archiving are going to continue along with the return to live performance. And that's going to, on the one hand, open up new possibilities for what attending a performance means, right? You can go to the venue live, you can stay in your living room and stream it, or you'll be able to watch it the next day. This, of course, has implications for the sorts of things Jess and Will are talking about, because if you stay home, you're not engaging in night culture. You're not going to a restaurant first and a bar afterwards, right? It becomes a much more solitary kind of engagement with the arts. I think there's a major gap between how performers and audience members, even when they're the same person, are relating to our digitally mediated realities. So I'm also a performer and I'm involved in all these new collaborations with people around the world, and we meet on Zoom and we perform together, and I enjoy that now. But then I have no interest in attending as a audience member some performance in the evening. There's this kind of disjunct between, I think, creation and consumption of the arts now in the digital domain. And I'll just finish by saying, of course, there's the subject of the screen, digital mediation, questions like latency, the good and bad, have become a major source of academic and critical scrutiny. And this has also given rise, I think, to more interactions between the academic communities and the cultural community, because it requires a certain kind of insider knowledge. And that, I think, is a good thing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Tania, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Clara. So again, I would like to thank as well the editors for all the work, for the vision of this book. I'm sure that all this multidisciplinary work comes at a time where we at least have marked the time of this pandemic, and probably a pandemic that has impacted us all and probably generations to come. A special thank you to Jean-Louis Denis also, who has allowed some space for work. And the title of the chapter that I presented with my co-authors is Teleworking Here to Stay? Learning from the COVID-19 Experimentation. So I come from an industrial relations school, and as much as the pandemic was difficult time, actually it became very exciting times for us, because we started as early as April 4th, 2020 to gather some data on what was happening in organization. Up until 1 year before, only 30% of the Canadians had teleworked on a regular basis. And all of a sudden, every person, every worker who could telework was teleworking, and it was working, and they were productive, and the economy continued thanks to telework. So what we tried to do is that to have a look at the possibility, the predisposition to be continuing teleworking after the pandemic. And again, I owe this extraordinary project that we started working on to my co-authors. First, Gaëlle Cachard-Rossé, who was acting as a postdoc at the chair, and she did this project it was her research project, so it was again very exciting. Alain Klarsfeld from France, from the Toulouse Business School, who is also a specialist in work organization and HR. And Kevin Carillo and Josiane Marsan. Kevin Carillo from France, also Toulouse Business School, and Josiane Marsan, Université Laval, two specialists in information systems, because again, telework was possible thanks to the technology, and we had to look at it in also from that perspective. So the main part, the main subject, what we were trying to show was to learn whether the adjustment that could come from a pandemic-induced telework would actually predict a post-pandemic deployment of telework. So we were always asking, do you want to continue? Do you see it as possible to continue telework afterwards? And we were able to gather a lot of data, and we were following teleworkers all through the starting April up until September 2020, and we started again 2021. But of course, the chapter is on the first series of data that was collected. So we were already able by then to see what are the effect of telework adjustment factors on the intention to continue telework. And we look at the enabling factors like work-life balance, like the fact that the reappropriation of time, whether it was working, being productive, being satisfied. And we had no idea how people were going to react. And we were all learning while we were collecting the data on how people were reacting to the telework. And of course, we looked at the risks like the isolation, the fact that we were distanced and we had to keep our distances, but also from a working perspective, this was problematic as well. We looked at the working conditions as well. We looked at some stress factors that were coming from the context of the pandemic. And we looked at the socio-demographic profiles. And as we were expecting that probably gender would have an effect, we found out that gender had no effect. Men as much as women wanted to continue telework. However, again, when we looked at the work-life balance and the capacity to balance work and family, it was more important for women to continue in that sense. However, what was interesting is to see that older teleworkers were even more likely to want to continue telework. Younger ones were not saying we don't want telework, but not 5 days a week and not as much and the same, in the same area. So what was important for us is to look at this shifting of the flexibility of worker arrangement and to see after the pandemic, the emergence of new models of work. This is what we learned from the pandemic. It's to get out of the mindset of only looking at telework from a flexibility arrangement and see whether in terms of working systems, we can start thinking about new models of work, which were more environmental friendly, work balance friendly, and again going into this new way of doing things and getting out of the 9-to-5 jobs every day, etc. We looked at the work system analysis, we looked at the skills gaps, and we look at how we need to reconfigure spaces, aligning them with the activities that we need, looking at some collaborative platform to help. So as a conclusion, we thought that we are probably, through this pandemic, really shaping the future of work through this experimentation that we were forced into it. It would have never happened without the pandemic, but I think that there are great things that are happening. I think the telework is compatible with consideration of well-being, work-life balance, respect to the environment, limiting travel. Telework offers this new way of reconfiguring work. It doesn't mean that we stay 5 days at home. This is not the way to think about it, but it's looking at the work system and defining activities that are compatible with work, with distance work. So thank you.
Thank you. Quill, do you want to present your chapter?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for organizing this. I'll talk very briefly about what I argued in the chapter and then give a few reflections on how things are changing and in flux. I was given the assignment of talking about the impact of the pandemic on cities, which obviously overlaps in interesting ways with the presentations that we've heard about nightlife and performance. In the first part of the paper, I looked at the impact of the pandemic on the form of cities itself. There are all sorts of pressures from the pandemic on both individuals and businesses to move out of crowded city centers and buildings with shared spaces into places with cheaper real estate and more space and more privacy. So there's a real risk of the pandemic resulting in an emptying out of city centers and in the decentralization of cities. And along with this, there's a risk of leaving behind those who can't do remote work or afford to move. So we are looking at a possibility of not only decentralization, but enhanced spatial inequality. I also looked at some of the design and planning initiatives that could keep city centers from hollowing out and dying, moves that we can make towards making the city a more controlled and orderly space and building in social distancing and orderly movement and separation into the design of cities. But really the sort of the philosophical heart of the paper was the second half, I guess, where I argued that the changes that we're seeing in cities and maybe need to see in order to preserve cities and keep them safe are fundamentally anti-urban. There's a real loss of the urban going on. And I framed the pandemic as an anti-urban force. And I talked about some of the existential losses that this entails. So I argued that spontaneity of contact and mixing with strangers and the uncontrolledness of space are not just incidental to cities, but actually essential to urban space. Meanwhile, this is exactly what we need to plan away if we want to make the centers of cities safer in the light of the pandemic. And this leads to two kinds of losses that I discussed in the paper. First, there's a subjective kind of phenomenological loss. For urban dwellers, our embodied sense of being at home in the city is really deeply disrupted and alienating because the way that we move through space and use our bodies and inhabit space and interact with those around us and the spaces around us is not only gone, but is replaced with something that feels quite risky and unstable. So I think to a large extent, as our embodied habits of how we use urban space have been challenged or taken away or streamlined or controlled in new ways, we've really lost a sense of embodied at homeness in the city. I argued that there are also more social losses to this de-urbanization. There's a decades worth of evidence that living in cities increases the embracing of diversity and helps people not feel threatened by diversity. It develops skills in people that give them the capacity to adjust quickly to the unexpected, and it makes them flexible. It makes them better at assessing risk and safety. And it seems like there are real losses if city living no longer involves these skills and capacities or this kind of bumping up against one another in uncontrolled ways. I also talked about the loss of third spaces, which are important sources of community and territory in cities. Third spaces are spaces that are neither home nor workspaces like barbershops, coffee shops, and bars, which were really especially hard hit by the pandemic. In cities where we, by design, are used to doing a lot of our living outside the home, third places for many of us play absolutely crucial roles in terms of giving us a sense of territory and community and at-homeness. And this has really been challenged by the pandemic. So I think there are real reasons for grief for those of us who love and are used to urban life. So let me briefly finish by talking about how things have changed. I wrote this piece pre-vaccination and before this whole cycle of waves and variants, before Delta and before Omicron, and a lot has changed. And I want to just make 2 points. One is, I think that what we could not have predicted was the sheer ongoing unpredictability of how cities would operate and how fast things would continue to change and swing back and forth and shift from month to month and week to week. It's turned out that there kind of is no new normal as to how we can use space and how risky the use of space feels, what's allowed, what isn't allowed, when and where we can put ourselves and be, when to mask, when not to mask, and so forth. In the paper, I speculated that things would restabilize as we learned new bodily habits and ways of moving through urban space. And these might be fundamentally anti-urban in the ways that I was grieving. They might be more controlled and more distanced, but they would come to feel natural to us as we develop new bodily habits. But at least so far, that hasn't actually happened. We haven't been able to develop any new bodily habits because the rules keep changing and our sense of danger and safety keeps changing almost weekly. This has led to a new existential problem, which is this extended, indeed endless feeling, exhausting cycle of never really feeling safe and at home, never knowing exactly what to do with our body or how it is or isn't okay to use space. I think this is deeply existentially exhausting and alienating. And so far, we just haven't developed new skills at using urban space. We haven't had any time to develop them. Finally, I'm fascinated by how COVID has really changed and reshaped the urban landscape itself materially. I think this is more, so I'm talking to you from Berlin. It's more true in Berlin than in North America, in my experience. Berlin's an extreme case, but it's a little bit true everywhere. In Berlin, we have test stations on every corner. They've popped up in bars, convenience stores, barbershops, closed down storefronts that closed during the pandemic. And the lines in front of these testing stations have their own new kind of body routines and body habits and new skills attached to that. And these dot the landscape. Meanwhile, we've got abandoned malls and airports and conference centers that have been transformed into massive vaccination sites. So bringing the 2 points that I was making here together, all of these new vaccination sites and testing centers, they all feel very temporary, very DIY. Every place is a pop-up. Everything is being used for something other than what it was designed for and is not built to last. So what we have is this very unstable, temporary feeling landscape. So it feels like the spaces that we're living in are shifty and unstable physically too, and not just socially, and not just from a health point of view. So I think that the fundamental shiftiness of urban space is really the take-home message that I want to get out of what's happened in the last year and a half, as opposed to the first 6 months of the pandemic. And for me, at least, it's hard to say anything now that predicts what cities are going to look like going forward, because we're in this fundamental period of flux. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Well, it's interesting that you talked about your argument about how planning that reduces uncontrolled contact is inherently anti-urban, because it leads me directly to a question that I wanted to ask to Eric and Will and Jess, which is that, Eric, you write about what we lose when performance-based arts, including concerts, are consumed online, but you also talk about how this may have opened up opportunities for rethinking these shows. And Will and Jess, you talk about the elaboration of a new vision of what nights in a pandemic society might be, and you present 2 images, one with a focus on festive outdoor spaces and another with a reopening of venues, but in a profoundly controlled fashion. And my question is, do you think that Quill's argument is also true for the objects of your chapters? In other words, do you think that physical presence and a sort of uncontrollability and mixing are at the core of nightlife and performance-based arts, and that pandemic-related restrictions and new formats run the risk of losing this core essence?
I'm happy to make a first set of comments. I mean, I don't think any of these are either or issues. Most of these raise certain opportunities and also are foreclosing certain things we're used to. So the embodied experience at performance is obviously crucial it's a lot more crucial, as say Will and Jess talk about in performances where there are mosh pits, than they are for arts where historically the presence of both the performers' bodies and the spectators' bodies are meant to be erased, like traditional Western art music performance, right, where you sit in the dark silently, right? There are certain things, I mean, I don't want to call them substitutes because they're different, but again, I think it's interesting to look at chat feeds during live performances as another site where certain kinds of interpersonal relations are being played out in real time of the sort that might not be able to be played out in traditional performance. Now, again, I'm not saying that they're as important, as valuable. I think it's just worth looking at the differences. You find people forming bonds of solidarity, commenting on what is happening in real time to each other, forming new friendships, forming alliances in ways that would often be difficult in a real performance space, particularly one where maybe you have to be quiet, or literally the music at the opposite extreme, the music is so loud you can't talk to the person next to you. So this is a different kind of what you might think digitally mediated embodied encounter, right? It's funny, it's almost like embodiment without the bodies, if that makes any sense at all. So yes, there is a real loss. Obviously, dance music and spaces that cater to dance music. This is crucial, but I'm sure Jess, Will, and Quill have a lot more to say on this than I do. Again, I was just trying to pick up on what is happening when you lack the embodied experience that might still be a kind of mediated intimacy that to offset what we lose when we lose embodied intimacy.
So yeah, I think all that is super powerful, but notice that one difference about these, one difference in these online spaces is that there's sort of a pre-curation of who you're going to run into. Everybody is there because they share a common interest and they've decided to make time for this particular performance. So despite the values, I think that there's something about the just, moving through urban space and running into random performances like street musicians and so on, which is a really different kind of experience where you don't get to pick who it is that you're up against. And the very intimacy that you're talking about, which is totally valuable and which I'm not knocking, is in some sense the opposite of the kind of urban kind of relationship with strangers that we develop as we move through space. So I don't want to value one or the other, but it's just interesting how they're not substitutable for one another, I don't think.
Yeah, I guess I was talking mainly about performance in both cases. I completely agree that, our interactions in urban spaces, which are highly unscripted, we've lost tremendous amounts of the sorts of things that you and others have pointed towards.
I have a really quick comment. When we were doing the public consultation in Montreal, circa November, December 2020, before the curfew, even we conducted focus groups with different communities groups and all sorts of people in the city. And I can give you an example, for example, from the queer people, like queer communities in Montreal, and how much they were doing the best they could with online performances and trying to build community online, which was important for them to feel connected, but they also miss it very much. The night is a space of care, and they usually les guérissons and this idea of care. Night is a space of community and care, and looking for this kind of possibilities of connection and being together. And they were really looking forward to this at the time. And they said the pandemic disrupted this completely. So it's beyond performance, but also finding communities. And we also found out that several immigrant groups in the city, people who live outside of the central areas too, they had to be very creative, trying to just keep it together, waiting for the pandemic to kind of like be over. They have an opportunity to be together and create together. And here we are talking about, let's say like informal, irregular, or even like illegal, I don't like this word, nightlife, because they're not always regulated or let's say legal or controlled by the city. So they have to this like spaces and territories of the city that are kind of like in a gray area, and they can create space for themselves there that they cannot find in like the mainstream performance venues in the city as well. So just like another example of the complexity of the problem.
I'll just, if I quickly just support what Quill said. I mean, I think lots of people found community, but the chance encounter, even, you know, what Marcus Anthony Hunter calls the round of nightlife, going around and bumping into people, reinforcing community, revitalizing contacts, that I think was missing. And certainly there was a point in the pandemic where I realized that although I was talking to lots of people all the time, I hadn't met anyone new in about 3 or 4 months. I mean, I'd sat in meetings with people I'd never met before. So there was a certain sort of stabilization of my social life, which is not, you know, entirely productive.
Yeah, to touch upon the same question, Tania, do you think that something fundamental about work is lost when it moves online?
Well, there are lots of advantages, but there are also some blind spots. And I think that what we have done, and I think what we have captured through this first chapter, which came in at, you know, and covered our earlier work, still stands. And this is, it's like a milestone in, you know, experiencing distance working. And I would say that today, and evolving on this matter and looking at, you know, now things in a more granular and different perspective. Yes, there are lots of blind spots that we have to look at. We have to look at inequalities. We have to look at some stress between employers that want their employees to come back to work, and this new way of finding reappropriation of time and liking it, distance working. Who's going to come back? Are women going to stay at home and work distance work because they like it and they can better organize their lives, their works, and balance family? And who's going to go back to work? And are people going to be more comfortable working in distance? So, you know, employers and management have to look at all this and cover blind spots and make sure that we are evolving, we are moving forward in a new model of work and not going back to some difficult times and not covering all the inequities that can come out of it. So, but it is an evolving, and still we can do something about the blind spots. We can look at them, we can analyze them, and it's not worth not looking at this way as a future of work. Anyhow, we have to adjust it.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And unfortunately, we already have to stop. I had 10 more questions for all of you. So unless you have any parting words for us, I think we're going to move on to panel 2.
Okay, so Jean-Louis, I'm the moderator of panel 2, so I invite the 3 panelists to open their camera. We're a little bit late, so I will do a very brief introduction. And like my colleague, I think the pandemic is sometimes frustrating, but it has been a very exciting time to think about major issues around politics, science, and in this case, a phenomena like health. I think the pandemic is a stress test for many governments, but also it's a great revelator of how politics may impact on the way we deal with à la fois science and health issue in society. So, and we have a very interesting panel to address this kind of question. I will briefly introduce you for the sake of time. So They are all three very estimated colleagues in their area. And we will do the presentation in order. So the first panelist will be Felix Rigoli. Felix is now researcher and lecturer at the Cultural and Scientific Foundation Fiocruz in Brazil, and he has a very wide experience in health policy issue in Latin American country related to his previous appointment at Pan American Health Organization Brasilia. Then the second panelist will be Tenbensel. Tim is professor of health policy at the School of Population Health at University of Auckland, New Zealand, and he's interested in looking at how health system transform or cannot transform or adapt to new situation, and his chapter in the book deal with mostly with the government response to the pandemic in New Zealand in relation to the scale of the phenomena of the pandemic in this country. And the third panelist is Nick King. He's professor at the bioethic units, I think at McGill. I saw different affiliation, but he's very interested in looking at how people interpret the potentiality of science and how it intersects with major social or ethical decisions. So thanks a lot to be here, and I will leave the floor to Felix. I hope you don't disappear. So, à ton tour.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Good afternoon to all of us. And thanks again to Jean-Louis, Catherine, Danielle, and especially to Clara for putting together this wide landscape of what was happening last year. We don't know exactly what is happening this year. And this is probably a great risk that we took writing in 2000, in the middle of the process. So, and that's, I think that's the interest also in this panel to discuss and to comment what happened, what were our theses and what happened later after we wrote and the book was already on the street, so we cannot change it now. In the case of our study, what we try to do is to take the case of Brazil as an example of how something that may be happening in other places, probably is happening everywhere in different degrees, of this new kind of governing through liberation of the capacities or the willing of the people in doing whatever they want. This kind of new populism that may be badly interpreted as liberation, like you don't need to follow any rules, you can do whatever you feel like, and how this system that we know, we can put names, Trump, Bolsonaro, perhaps Modi in India, perhaps Boris Johnson in the UK, may represent in some part this spirit. But what happens with this kind of new conception is confronted with an agent that is impervious. The virus doesn't mind too much about the political regime or the political or the philosophy. So, and what I try to describe in the chapter is how in the case of Brazil, but with many references to other places, this kind of idea that we don't need a state at the end of the day, and that we can go back to a previous, supposedly ideal state which everyone can get their arms, can get their own protection, don't need to vaccinate, don't need to use masks, don't need to take care of other people. how this reacts with a virus, that we have another behavior. And in a certain way, the thing that I would like to say after most of these things have happened, still in Brazil, this is happening, but in the US and in other places has changed, is that probably the people have more wisdom than we thought. And they didn't like this in the US, they didn't like this in Brazil. The popularity of Bolsonaro is falling through the floor. And so the idea that I would like to present in the chapter, but also to remark here and perhaps to develop in the future, is that this kind of populism that points out to the freedom of each one, not to the freedom of the people, of the collective people, but of the person that can use their own ways of having their own state. The sign that everyone has his own or her own state. This is not the way to face, not even a pandemic. It's not the way, obviously not the way to face the climate change. It's not the way of taking any kind of collective response. And so this is the thesis of the book and the hope that people learn about this and will not repeat this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Felix, and we will revisit some of these issues. Tim, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone from Saturday in New Zealand. And I would firstly like to thank Jean-Louis and the other editors for the opportunity to be part of this, which has been very stimulating and I think a nice contrast with other parts of academic work. So I am eternally grateful for being part of this project. I would really, I think it's a master stroke of, or just a wonderful bit of curating to have the chapter about Felix's chapter and the chapter on New Zealand sort of bumping up against each other. And I'm not sure how intentional this was. I suspect it was, but we have two ends of a spectrum, I would say. So just almost anything you could see from Felix's chapter, we may have, in a sense, the opposite conditions in New Zealand, and I think that's very interesting because in the context of COVID, New Zealand is, and I think Nick mentions in his chapter, sort of the policy success or the of the New Zealand government's approach to dealing with COVID. And in case you're wondering, since publication, as of yesterday, throughout the whole pandemic, there was only 52 deaths from COVID, which is 1 per 100,000. This may change in the next few weeks very quickly because Omicron has not yet hit, or it's just starting to affect us. So many of these things could be totally redundant within a few weeks from now. So just sort of bear that in mind. I think the big question that I wanted to deal with, though, is if we're comparing New Zealand's or comparing any country's response to policy response to COVID, inevitably you get to this question of proportionality. And just and it is worth mentioning that the response in New Zealand was very stringent and has been very stringent at various times. And so the restrictions on workplace, sort of working, basically the whole economy. So I mean, all workplaces were closed apart from a bunch of designated essential workplaces. Similar things to what we've seen elsewhere, but the length of time was interesting. The in sort of April, May 2020, the capacity to interact with anyone else outside your household was extremely restricted. Of course, one can connect these the stringency of these restrictions to the policy success. However, what this does, and what is interesting, is how this affects the politics of COVID, the policy debates, and the lens through which people in New Zealand view what is happening. So, sort of something that may be pretty inconceivable in other countries. I think the emblematic example is the eventual resignation of the Minister of Health in middle of 2020, and the two cardinal sins that this minister committed was to go on his mountain bike in a forest 2.3 kilometers away from his house. And the second cut was the fact that two people who'd been given compassionate consideration to return to New Zealand sort of broke the rules, decided to drive from one city to another, and this was all the media were talking about for a few days in June 2020. So there's this very bizarre, or there has been this very bizarre, kind of lens through which things have been viewed in New Zealand, which is almost the other side of the coin to the success in keeping COVID out, or relatively out. Now, I think the broader point I wanted to make in the chapter is the indexicality, which is a concept taken from the sociologist Andrew Abbott, which is what are our frames of reference when we're looking at what the appropriateness of what governments have done, and our frames of reference in New Zealand are quite compared to other countries quite different, and that is the example I gave is just emblematic of that. So we have a very different political universe, and there is, I think this has lessons for non-COVID policy issues, where the local, contextual, historical frames of reference in dealing with any issue, whether it be climate change, whether it be the structuring of the health system, these are all much more shaped by local histories and contexts than how we compare to other countries in the world. And I think this is a general lesson which is often, I think, forgotten, but COVID has sort of brought it very much to the foreground. There's some things that I would have liked to gone into in a bit more detail, and maybe there will be opportunities for that later, which is around, again, relating to Nick's point about in his chapter about how governments in New Zealand, or compared to others, listened to the advice of public health experts. And again, there's another sort of set of interesting dynamics there, which I'm happy to answer questions on, but I didn't really get a chance to sort of develop in the chapter. The dynamics described in the chapter are still, these are still happening to some extent. So the attention given to just the one person breaking the rules that might lead to an Omicron outbreak. This was a high-profile British DJ, by the way, that just started meeting people a couple of days early than he should have out of quarantine, and then was tested positive. Again, there are more recent examples, but I think the overall message of the chapter is that most policy debates, including COVID, are highly indexical, making comparative policy research and exercise to approach with great care. And the scale and intensity and content of policy debates and responses is only weakly related to the scale of problems when such scales can be prepared. So the broad theme is the scale-free nature of trying to understand policy responses to COVID. So I think I'll leave it there, but happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thanks. Nick, please.
Great. Well, I actually prepared a slideshow, so which makes me a bit of an outlier, but so first I'll say thank you and merci beaucoup to the organizers, to Jean-Louis and Clara and my co-panelists, Tim and Felix. And my chapter was called Science and Public Policy in a Post-Pandemic World. The thing that I think we've all noticed and that Tim and Felix both alluded to is that we've really seen the best and worst of times in the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the relationship between science and public policy. And, you know, as Tim mentioned, I called out, you know, Jacinda Ardern as one of the best exemplars. And then we could also call out Trump or Johnson or Bolsonaro as some of the worst exemplars in the case of the interface between science and public policy. And I focused in particular on what I've come to call the politics of uncertainty. And that is how uncertainty plays a role in science, in public policy, and in the interface between the two. And I just give you a couple very brief examples. Early on in the pandemic in particular, the role of epidemiologic modeling was foregrounded. The models produced by Neil Ferguson, the since disgraced Neil Ferguson and his colleagues at Imperial College, have been widely credited as finally convincing Johnson and Trump to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And for a sort of brief moment, epidemiologic models were seen as kind of our saviors and as an exemplar of governments listening to science. But very quickly there was a backlash, because when the epidemiologic modelers updated their models to take into account new information and changing circumstances, as they should be doing, they were met with a backlash. This is from a Washington Post story quoting Deborah Birx, Trump's COVID-19 task force advisor, and Fox News anchor Laura Ingraham, both expressing the idea that because modelers had updated their models, they were changing their mind, which casts into doubt everything about the models and about scientific expertise in general. And this was part and parcel of a kind of populist refrain regarding science that we saw in a number of countries. And it led Neil Ferguson, in the US, infectious disease modelers Mark Lipsitch, to take to Twitter to defend themselves, to say, look, this is the normal way we do modeling. More recently here in Quebec and in Canada, we've seen an example when Horacio Arruda stepped down and had come under pretty vitriolic criticism for changing his mind on masks, on vaccines, on lockdowns, and so forth. I won't get into the politics of that, but it's just a recurrent theme that we've seen across the world. And my chapter asks, you know, what's going on here? Well, I think a lot is going on. I think there are a lot of answers that are wrong, or at least incomplete. Most people said this is science versus anti-science, or bad science versus good science, or people aren't listening to the experts or the right experts, or that, you know, masks or vaccines are being politicized, or we just need more data. And there may be a ring of truth to any of these things, but I think it's incomplete and it misses a fundamental point, which is I think this was illustrations of what I've called the weaponization of uncertainty in disputes over the proper place of scientific evidence and expertise in policymaking and public life. And I ask, how do we counteract this? How do we make democracies a safe space for science? And I think that answer depends on your model of science and what makes it special and why that matters for policy. And I propose three different ideas of the specialness of science, which point to three ways forward. The first, I think, is the most conventional version, and it's articulated by the political scientist William Davies, where he says, look, the ideal of modern science is that scientists are not like the rest of us. They can separate their feelings from their observations. They can play down values and emotionals and act as sort of automata we can look to for objective, accurate apprehensions of the world. Scientists are objective, neutral, unbiased, and able to distinguish that which is a matter of fact from that which is one of perspective, and that's how policy should be made. A second version is kind of the internalist dialogue provided by many scientists themselves, where they say it's not about the qualities of the science, it's about scientists, it's about the methods that we use. And we put our faith and trust in these methods. This is from a National Academy of Scientists report. You know, it's logical consistency, it's hypothesis testing, it's theory modification. And that's what makes science special. It's a set of principles and methods to accurately describe, explain, and predict what's going to happen in the world. And that's what we must base policy in. I'd say some combination of these two definitions are at the basis of what the modern evidence-based policy movement is all about. They say this is why science and scientific evidence should play a special role within public policy. Sort of to conclude, I'll say I think those are both wrong. I think they're wrong because they don't describe how science actually works. And they neglect the fact that scientists are fallible, biased human beings. And I think what really sets them apart from others is not superior objectivity or a peculiar methodology, but a set of common values and norms. And these are norms and values central to scientific institutions that, almost like a Venn diagram, overlap really well with democratic values. I'm just going to go through this. So I think that science is a value-laden, historically contingent, and context-dependent form of producing knowledge, which has no special claim to truth or efficacy above others, but whose values are best foundation for policy. Some of those values and norms, well, Robert Merton articulated them many years ago, and they're sort of old-fashioned as accurate descriptions of what science is, but as values that I think are common between democracy and science, I think they're useful. And I just add comfort with uncertainty, and I'll conclude by doing something really weird, which is quoting myself from the conclusion of my chapter, saying, taken together, I think these values accord well with broader democratic ideals of inclusion, openness, and transparency, and can inform the institutional design of science and its role in public policymaking in the future. And that's it. And I will just say, weirdly enough, I stand completely true. I don't think anything has changed. If anything, I think we need to look to these values even more now than we have in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, like in the first panel, we can go for hours listening to the panelists. Thank you, the three of you. And maybe I start with the first question about the role of political regime and the influence on the response to the pandemic in various jurisdictions. And maybe it started with Felix, like Brazil as a federalist political regime. And when we look, like some states have a more energetic responses than other, I think. So maybe you can comment on this.
Yes, actually the balance between federal, state, and municipalities showed that without central command, without central guidelines and orientation and even funding, most states are unable to coordinate too much, and most municipalities are completely powerless because they have for instance, to produce vaccines and to distribute vaccines cannot be done at any municipal level. It could have been done at state level. And actually in some states that happened late, but happened. And at the same time, the federal government decided to block the possibilities that the states, each one, may begin to vaccinate before the federal government, which was another discussion, and it was based in a certain valuable principle, that is to have the complete health system together, beginning at the same time with the same criteria. So it was a mixed response. But I think that the main lesson is that this also was a stress test on what is to be federal. So what are the powers, let's say, in an invasion of an army? What can be done by the states or by the municipalities separately? probably very few. And this in a certain way was like a war effort. So it showed the weakness of what may be called federal, but it's actually much less autonomous than it could be. Interestingly enough, very few municipalities did, for instance, complete lockdowns or did, because also there was a perverse cross-fertilization. If my neighbor allows the stores to function, why I will take the risk, and some of them took the risk to close everything. My cases went down. My hospitals began to be filled by the people that were sick in the neighbors. So in a certain way, also this idea that federal autonomy is a really a very good concept.
Thank you, Nick or Tim. Any additional comments on this one? Nick, Tim, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, and so the experience of New Zealand as a unitary country is the complete opposite in that respect as well, where there and here, so say comparisons with other federal countries with similarities or closer similarities such as Australia or Canada, I think are instructive as well. And I think what is one thing, let's be clear, New Zealand was not prepared, did not have the public health infrastructure that was very well prepared for a pandemic of any sort. So it really has been the political structure and the unitary nature of the political structure that in this case has been a big advantage. Of course, it's a disadvantage in many other contexts, but I think it's an advantage in terms of the clarity of communication and the less opportunity for mixed messages and different sort of approaches and comparison with different approaches. So it's complete opposite, but instructive for what happens.
Thank you. Nick, do you have a comment on this one? Maybe another question. We discuss a lot about the role of science, the role of so-called expert advisory system, and we don't talk a lot about the content of knowledge or science that is mobilized in these difficult periods, like you refer, Nick, to the role of modeling, and there's a lot of discussion these days about the potential role of social science and humanities in thinking about government response to the pandemic. So maybe, Nick, your feeling on this?
Yeah, it's such a huge issue, and I think there's sort of three things at work. One, which gets back to the previous question, is actual institutional design, right? So literally, if you're going to have a scientific advisor, are they going to be a political appointee? Are they going to be a civil servant? Are they going to be a public-facing figure like Fauci in the US, right? Or, sort of Arruda in Quebec? Mm-hmm. Are they going to be more behind the scenes providing recommendations, right? I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but it's very clear that once someone who's charged with providing good scientific advice becomes a public figure who also has to be a mouthpiece for the policies, they open them up to the kind of political castigation and potential scapegoating that I think makes it impossible for them to function as a good advisor anymore. Even Fauci, Saint Fauci for many people, has made a lot of missteps, and I think that's because he's taken such a public role. I said three things. I actually only mean two things. The second thing is, as you say, in whom do we vest the mantle of being a mouthpiece, a spokesperson for reliable evidence? And again, if we are basing that trust in the ideal of infallibility, I think it's just the wrong road to go down. In part because I think, as you're gesturing toward, even within academia, different disciplines have laid claim to infallibility, right? So I don't want to generalize too much, but let's just say, the hard sciences and the social sciences that model themselves on that, like economics, have kind of laid claim to, we are the infallible experts who describe the world as it is. And the softer sciences, social sciences, humanities that open a space for uncertainty and fallibility are seen as not as reliable. And that's a problem, right? I think there's definitely a place for anyone with good insight and useful knowledge. The problem is if everything is shackled to this ideal of infallibility and objectivity. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you. We just have time, maybe Felix or Tim on this issue of science and policy, and then we will have to move to the next panel. Tim or Felix?
Yeah,
Tim?
okay. Yeah, one thing I think that just sort of might complicate things a bit more is that no policy issue relies on a single source of science. And it's actually the dialogue between epidemiological research, perhaps economic research, perhaps other types of modelling. In policy making, it's one thing I always emphasise to students is nobody knows everything. Everybody knows something, and I think there's a danger, and I think Nick, your argument is great for sort of, I think, preparing the space for this. Is that there's a danger that the science is described in monolithic terms, because science there are multiple. It's multivocal, and certainly is throughout the pandemic. And I think there's a great chapter in another book that Jean-Louis has edited about the British response and the institutions of science. In the UK or in England, from an insider from Public Health England, that really sort of illustrates this point extremely well.
Okay, thank you. I hope it. Yes, Felix.
The last comment is that in Brazil there was no qualified, renowned scientist in charge of any of the 27 states, federal government, or large municipalities, so it was really absent from government. The science was absent from government.
Thank you. I hope it is just the starting point of a conversation on these issues. So thanks a lot. And I think if I understand the rule, we have a kind of 2 minutes break to transition to the third panel, to not being too much overload about information and ideas. So maybe a 2 minutes break, then Catherine will lead the last panel.
So hi, everybody. I think our 2 minutes is up. We were a bit ambitious with the program, I think, but when we are in good company, it's tough the time flies. So that's the last panel, the third one. I invite all the speakers to turn their camera on, please. Okay, so for the next 30 minutes, we are going to talk about health. So health obviously was at the forefront of the pandemic issues and effort. So there is a lot to discuss there for sure. So we have a panel composed of 4 people. First, we have Lisa Forman, a wonderful colleague of mine and a friend of mine as well. So she's a Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and Global Health Equity, and an associate professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. So she would talk about the future of health and human rights in pandemic societies, a very important issue for sure. Second, we're going to listen to Pierre Larouche, a colleague of mine at the University of Montreal. He holds the Chair of Law and Innovation at the University of Montreal and is a full professor at the Faculty of Law. He will talk about a chapter we co-write together. So it's about the role of the WHO during the pandemic and what we can learn from the stress tests that the organization has gone through during that period. Third person is going to be Pascale Lehoux. She's a full professor with the Department of Health and Management, Evaluation and Policy at the School of Public Health, University of Montreal. She will explore the issue of vaccine development during COVID and what we can and what it means for responsible health innovation path creation. And also, last but not least, we're going to listen to Barbara Neis. She's a John Lewis Patton Distinguished University Professor at the Department of Sociology at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. And she would talk about how we can move forward after the pandemic based on occupational health and safety lessons learned. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. So when Catherine approached me asking if I wanted to contribute to this book, I immediately said yes, both because I absolutely love working with Catherine, but also because the invitation was just fantastic, you know, to come to me as a right to health scholar and ask in the middle of, you know, a massive global health emergency, how do we think about the future of health and human rights right now? And it was we were 1 year into the pandemic, and it was a really interesting place to look back at what had come, to look forward at what was coming. And, you know, one of the first speakers said, you know, it's very dangerous to be making projections about what's to come when so little is known. And absolutely, I think we can maybe all be comfortable with a fair amount of willingness to be wrong here. But from a human rights perspective, it was clear almost instantly that COVID was going to have a massive impact on human rights and on international law. And so in the chapter for the book, I looked at, rather than just describing what is happening around human rights and international law, which is very significant, I tried to bring some theoretical conceptual lenses to understanding what we were looking at, where we might go. And I did so through the lens of two conceptual ideas that are very dominant, both in health and human rights and in international law. The first is the idea that health and human rights are indivisible and interconnected, and you need for good health, you need good human rights. And the second is the idea that in massive crisis, in times of massive crisis, from an international law perspective, it often can sort of be a shock to the system that opens windows of opportunity for potentially significant reform. And so, so instantly from a human rights perspective, we saw the truth of that proposition that health and human rights are fundamentally interconnected, and not necessarily in a positive way. Very, very quickly, governments were using COVID as a pretext to abuse rights, to lift the rule of law, to crack down on civil society, as a mechanism of social control at the more kind of sort of at the more autocratic side. But we also saw, sort of across nations, a real challenge of how to work out the appropriate balance between meeting the critical imperative of public and global health that we face in the context of a pandemic, and balancing individual rights. And to some extent, some of that again falls into the range of abuse, just sort of clearly disproportionate use of rights and of law to that it bears no real necessity to a public health end. But also, what we also saw was that the system of rules as we know them around the restriction of rights, primarily the Syracuse principles, are not adequately descriptive when it comes to what is an appropriate restriction of rights in the context of a public health emergency. And not just in the context of what is an appropriate restriction of civil and political rights in the context of a public health emergency, but an almost complete absence of attention to what it means to apply that thinking to the restriction of economic, social, and cultural rights when you're meeting public health goals in a crisis. And particularly what it means to restrict what are legitimate and illegitimate restrictions of the right to health in the context of a health emergency. Something that, we're dealing with disruptions to access to essential healthcare services, access to essential goods and services that are necessary in the context of COVID, both within countries and between. So instantly, I think COVID let us know that the system of rules that we have are not adequate. We need better than what we have. And I think where we saw this most egregiously has been in the broader area of global health law, particularly in the international health regulations, which is the primary international law instrument to deal with government response. And that has been, I think, one of the more really difficult parts of what has happened in COVID is the extent to which the IHR, the international health regulations, have been more or less ignored in very significant ways when it comes to key aspects of responses to COVID, from data sharing to travel restrictions. And so I think we're in COVID leaves us in an inflection point in terms of where we go. And I don't know whether the window of opportunity that is opened is the possibility of positive reform that we would hope it would be. We clearly are, sort of what comes in the next year or so around a pandemic treaty, around some of the other thinking in terms of legal institutional reform is going to matter tremendously. But it's very hard right now in the context of, sort of certainly as an international human rights lawyer, to feel any sense of hope. There's a pervasive sense of despair in the community of academics that I work with, where sort of the high-minded principles which we really have always aspired to in international things like solidarity have just proven to be, they're just not in the room. I mean, it's not it's every person, every country for themselves in the context of this crisis. So I, Catherine asked, I'll close shortly with this. Catherine asked, what is the thing we didn't speak about that we wish we had? I'm currently really trying to figure out, how do we have hope? And a brilliant colleague of mine at the U of T, the University of Toronto, speaks about this, Paul Frere's idea of critical hope as something, it's absolutely essential to people working in social justice, that we need to bring kind of like a compassion and a care and, all these like sort of non-academic, softer, interpersonal qualities to what we're doing. And that's something that I'm kind of holding on to right now, and as a way to kind of go into the future. So I'll close there.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So next it's Pierre.
Thank you, Catherine. So the chapter that Catherine and I and other co-authors wrote in Pandemic Societies, I think it stands out by the number of authors because it's for us, it started from another project. So we were interested, and that's a project that was initiated by Catherine and Jean-Louis to really try to understand the circulation of norms between the WHO and the national legal orders. And of course, this proved to be an extraordinary case to look at this and to test our theories. So the chapter is part of the work of this bigger project, and as such, all of us chipped in, and we have been supported by very good junior researchers who did some of the more empirical work in the chapter. But we were looking at two cases. So the WHO recommendations on border controls and the various instruments that were issued regarding masks, and trying to see, well, how was this received? What does it tell us about the way these norms circulate and about what we call the normative leadership of the WHO? So I will spare you the empirical overview. You can see this in the chapter and go straight to the conclusions to leave a bit of time for discussion as well. So what we saw was the WHO found itself in these two cases. So the border controls and masks in the first half of 2020, that's what we were studying at the time. It found itself in the crossfire between the member states. And there's a significant accountability gap, not just at the WHO level, what is going on inside, but also from the members to the WHO. They do not, and as Lisa reported, so they do not comply with their obligations to supply information to the WHO to start with, and these obligations could be improved. And we found that the WHO had kind of, over the years, it has a certain expert authority, actually relatively strong, but its normative authority has never been, let's say, established to the same level. And it could be visible in these two case studies. And here as well, the pandemic was, as many of you have already pointed out, revealed things that were already there, but it was the extreme case that shows the weaknesses in the system. We could also witness the problems that arose from the fact that there's no dispute resolution mechanism and there's no mechanism for state responsibility. And we looked at it. So what could be recommended out of all of this? Well, what the pandemic showed was things that were already in the international health regulations, for instance, regarding border controls. The WHO is supposed to arbitrate between public health and the need to keep movement of goods and the movement of travelers going on. And I think on lower level public health incidents, it's probably something that the WHO can do well. But what the pandemic revealed is when it's about shutting down the economy and closing the borders, all of a sudden the decisions go to the prime minister or the president's desk where they belong. These are heavily political decisions. And the WHO is simply not equipped to do these are heavy policy arbitrations. And the question is, should the WHO try to improve on this or maybe become a global center of expertise and say, look, we may not tell you whether it's justified to close the border or not, but here's all the information you need to know on the public health side to make your decision. And let's agree that this is the basis. And the last recommendation or last point we looked at is there any way for the WHO to get out of the crossfire? So once it becomes, let's say, a pin in arguments between, let's say, the US and China, it's not in a position to win anything on these, in this discussion. It's not the organization that can measure up to a large country. Is there any way for the WHO to try to get out of the crossfire and try to return these disputes where they belong, i.e. disputes between states and not disputes between a state and the WHO? And here as well, so when we talk about looking into solving the accountability gap, maybe the WHO can start profiling itself more as a place where that gives structure for states to settle these things between themselves, but leave the WHO out of the dispute. So that's a quick summary of what we had in our chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. So Barbara, you're next. Oh, no, sorry, I think it's Pascale.
Thanks.
About that, Pascale.
Thank you. That's right the moment where my cat wants attention. He was quiet all the way up there. So the main argument of the chapter is really simple and an easy one to make. What we say is that vaccines against COVID-19 could have been developed and commercialized differently. So this is a simple, straightforward argument, but the way the chapter was written is much more complex and complicated. So what my colleagues and I have tried to do is a work of fiction. So a year ago, we tried to envision or imagine or invent how these vaccines could have been developed differently. And this work of fiction was informed by scientific research, of course, on innovation development. And that is a key concept in innovation development that has to do with path dependence and path creation. Path dependence, in a nutshell, is when you're only able to do what you've been able to do so far because there are lock-ins, economics, technological, and political. Path creation was a nice idea to explore because perhaps in times of crisis, it's possible to go broader and think about different ways of building these vaccines. So at the end of the chapter, so we end up with two solutions, one that is close to the RNA-based vaccines because they're they're easier to produce. And here the idea was to build capacities in low and middle income countries. And another vaccine was a single dose vaccine that would be distributed to a micro needle patch. So no syringes, no vials. And this idea was based on the last mile delivery issue. So getting the vaccines to the people who need them most is the most difficult thing. And why we came to this end in the story and what we invented, there are a number of key assumptions. First, vaccines are a common good. Second, it's a pandemic, so you need a global response. And to have this global response, we invented the idea that the United Nations had an emergency general assembly in which they really struggle, in part with the World Trade Organization. You may remember that India and South Africa had asked for a waiver on intellectual property. And we took these two ideas seriously together. Vaccines are a common good, intellectual property is an obstacle, funding is present, and a lot of people around the globe are ready to chip in, meaning with their brain and resource. So in this process, we had a lot of input from civil society, including people who know a great deal about infectious disease, and they're located in low and middle income countries. And the last assumption that is really important has to do with the fact that we're still in another crisis, which is climate change. And unless we don't learn how to combine health innovation with a serious consideration of environmental consideration, we won't get out of any other crisis. So what I didn't talk about and that I could have changed looking at how the pandemic evolved now has to do with Nicholas King said earlier. I think a year ago, I felt fallible in my work of fiction. But one thing that I would have loved to do was to share this chapter with infectious disease specialists, virologists, scientists who are aware of all the intricacies of zoonotic disease. So that have to do with environment, health, and the planet more globally. And because I believe, and if you've read the chapter by Jean-Louis, you will understand where I'm getting, because we really need to have these true in-depth dialogue between disciplines and really understand, because we all knew 2 years ago that a single biomedical approach or solution would fail. We also knew that public health is great, but there's no one single magic bullet. So we need a global response. And I think that we could have created it if we have taken away the obstacles of intellectual property. And we have thought about a long-term investment in low and middle income countries and emerging economies that are perfectly capable of producing vaccines. So how the chapter changed the way I think about my research. This was one of the questions the editors of the book put forward. And when I talk about my work about responsible innovation, I often feel that people may believe that I'm a bit naive. and they're not wrong. But the real naivete in my mind lies with not with responsible innovation in health and how we can do more desirable innovation pathways, but that naivete really has to do with the way we hold on to an obsolete political and economic ideology, order, theory, understanding, call it whatever, because this economic system is not fit for purpose for 21st century challenges. It's not, it will not get us where we want to be. And as you've seen, the vaccines distribution globally is awfully disbalanced. And we are talking about a third and a fourth dose, or definitely we're not out of it. So I believe that we really need to think about how we can build mutually beneficial relationships between health, the economy, the environment, and societies. And this makes sense when you look at innovation and how innovation changed social relations, because choosing one's innovation pathway is literally to choosing one's political economy. And I believe this is what matters most at this moment. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Pascale. Barbara.
Thanks very much. I'm really enjoying this event, and I'm really enjoying the book. Before I provide a high-level summary of our chapter in Pandemic Societies, I've been asked to say a few words about the lead author for the chapter, Professor Catherine Lapel. Catherine Lapel, Distinguished Research Chair in Occupational Health and Safety Law at the University of Ottawa, passed away peacefully on September 23rd, 2021 at the age of 67. A Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a member of the Order of Canada, and recipient of the Gold Medal of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Catherine was a prolific and outstanding public intellectual who over her career supervised hundreds of graduate students and led critical and groundbreaking Canadian and international research in the linked fields of occupational health and safety and workers' compensation law and policy. She was fundamentally committed to identifying and addressing, in partnership with unions and community groups, threats to the dignity, rights, health and safety, and livelihoods of workers. She spent the last year and a half of her life doing not only her regular research and teaching, but monitoring, analyzing, and speaking out about the impacts of the unfolding pandemic on workers' health. This chapter grew out of that pandemic-related work. Tributes to her life can be found on the website of the University of Ottawa and of the On the Move partnership, which I lead. The chapter Catherine led and to which I contributed, along with our colleague Phil James in the UK, is entitled Occupational Health and Safety Lessons Learned Moving Forward After the Pandemic. The chapter argues that the COVID-19 pandemic has served to both confirm and accentuate trends in the regulation of occupational health and safety that have long been argued to be damaging. In doing so, it has illustrated mechanisms by which governments can sacrifice workers in the interests of other social and economic objectives. We support this argument by examining gaps in effective regulatory protection that have become evident during the course of the pandemic, drawing on examples from Canada and the UK, and focusing on three occupational contexts in which regulatory gaps and organizational factors have contributed to the disproportionate exposure of workers to the hazards of COVID-19: precarious employment, mobile work, and employment in the healthcare sector. UK experiences, like those in Canada and elsewhere, have confirmed that workplace settings have provided an important platform for the spread of COVID-19, with public-facing occupational groups, including healthcare staff and taxi and bus drivers, as well as rotational workers housed in work camps and temporary foreign workers living in bunkhouses at disproportionate risk. The vulnerabilities of these groups have often been compounded by existing inequalities, including ethnic and health-related ones. Existing research has also drawn attention to government failures to protect staff through the provision of adequate personal protective equipment and testing and oversight regimes, as with, for example, the healthcare sector. A key issue related to work-related COVID risk is who is the regulator of occupational health and safety in a pandemic. Competing roles to regulate health and safety and more broadly public health in the context of a pandemic have led to contrasting results, partly depending on whether, as in Quebec, the public health regulator already had a mandate to protect workers' health prior to the pandemic. In Quebec, collaboration between the health and safety and public health authorities is not unusual, and the network of public health doctors is an integral part of the health and safety regulatory regime. This is not the case in other Canadian provinces, where public health authorities appear less focused on working conditions of essential workers. Despite this variability, all of these jurisdictions have undergone major cutbacks to the public health care system as a result of several waves of austerity measures, and this contributed to high numbers of infections, including in the healthcare sector, due in part to limited access to N95s. Overlap in jurisdiction within a given territory further undermines regulatory effectiveness, as in the case of an outbreak of COVID-19 in 2 poultry processing plants in British Columbia, where federal authorities have jurisdiction on food inspection, while provincial authorities have jurisdiction on health and safety, and the food safety personnel did not recognize the worker safety issues. Workers who live in one jurisdiction and work in another, members of what we call the mobile labor force, are governed by different regulatory bodies for work, home, and sometimes travel between work and home, as with rotational workers, temporary foreign workers, and seafarers. These workers were often afterthoughts in the planning of each province and in international planning, as in the case of seafarers. Alberta, for example, concluded that work in the oil sands was essential, while failure to prevent outbreaks in camps led to consequences for home provinces and territories, including Indigenous communities, far less likely to have health facilities and emergency care required to manage the outbreaks. Overall, work organizations, such as heavy reliance on temp agency workers employed in multiple workplaces in healthcare, is often an invisible variable in the regulation of health and safety. If the health and safety regulator and the public health authorities had taken work organization into account more systematically, this would have reduced the spread of COVID-19 and the burden borne by workers. Shining light on invisible workforces, including mobile workers, precarious migrants, and the precariously employed, would have done a great deal in preventing transmission to workers and from workers to communities. Ensuring these workers have access to healthcare and social benefits is an essential step in protecting not only them, but also their colleagues and the communities in which they live, a conclusion applicable in all jurisdictions.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So I see it's almost 3 o'clock, but I think we should take at least 5 minutes to discuss a little bit. So if people have to go, obviously we understand. Very briefly, I just want to touch a few points and then let you decide whether you want to answer a comment. But I think we're hearing more and more, at least at the international level, that the pandemic has been a triumph for science, but a failure for humanity. So I was wondering, depending on your viewpoints, what do you think can do better to work on that humanity aspect? And I was hearing loud and clear Lisa's comments about the need for hope. So perhaps we can be a bit positive here. The other point is it's tough to have a panel about the pandemic and health without talking about the future of healthcare systems, right? Because there are major challenges that lie ahead in post-pandemic societies, which includes rebuilding healthcare systems. Probably will be one of the most pressing one, with exhausted human resources, important backlog in healthcare services, and so on. So when we work on these rebuilding efforts, where do you think we should start, and what would be the key to really move forward in a good direction there? So these are my 2 comments. I have many others, but I think we're limited now. So
I'll take maybe I try that first the observation about this being a triumph for science, but did you say a failure?
Yeah, I heard that. It was pretty strong, I thought.
So I mean, I think sort of our healthy skepticism of the altruism and high-mindedness of governments and institutions can only be reinforced in this pandemic. And maybe the answer is, as it always has been in the context of human rights, that it's not sufficient. The critical variable that we need to have on the table, that we need to have in the room, is civil society and social movement and the voice of public opinion. It's what matters to companies, it's what matters, it's what can force better outcomes and always has forced better outcomes in the human rights context. I mean, in Pascale, sort of my doctoral focus was on access to antiretrovirals and the extent to which human rights interplayed or didn't interplay with intellectual property rights, and the interplay between innovation and rights, and so I see one of the attendees ask that question about where does this leave civil public participation, and are the institutions enough? So I won't try are the institutions enough. We know that they're not enough, and designed to not be enough. The WHO was not created to be able to succeed at its mandate of the attainment of the highest standard of health. For if it were the case, it would have a hell of a lot more money and autonomy than it has. But I think that's purposeful. So maybe that's the hopeful part, that it's kind of like we're the key variable, like how we operationalize that. Well, I think, that we all have to figure out ourselves, but that has to be the part where we, sort of the lesson from historical human rights struggles has always been the most effective, progressive outcomes come from very significant civil society pushes for better outcomes.
Thank you, Lisa. Pascale, you want to comment? Especially since the triumph for science and failure for humanity was linked to the vaccine's progress.
I kind of agree with your conclusion, Catherine, but it's not just science, because science also needs to be part of a re-envisioning of what commercialization means. Because science was strong, and as soon as pharmaceutical companies stepped in, the game changed. It was the governments paid twice for the vaccine, and this is business as usual. So these are the paths we need to change. And reason for hope for humanity, I believe, will come also from the economic thinkers, because you may not like my answer, but there are economists who are brilliant and think about the way we can have a caring society, have a regenerative economy, and can meet the challenges of climate change with viable ways of distributing services and goods. And I believe that there are a number of institutions that need to be entirely renovated. And the World Trade Organization is one, WHO may be one, but this will require a capacity, because when you mention recovery for healthcare system, if we start with the same old frameworks, we will not build something new. And where are these frameworks that are new, unthink about yet, or have not been taken seriously yet? There exist, but we need to solicit, to reach out to people who have brains and know ways to reconcile the environment, economy, and society. And it's 21st century juncture, and I think something is important to understand at this point in time. And so there's hope. I will stop.
Very important comment, Pascale. You will need people with your expertise for sure to avoid going back to the old ways and building on new pathways. So, Pierre, you want to comment, especially since Pascale talked about the WTO?
Well, first I wanted to say something about your triumph for science, failure for humanity.
It's not from me, right?
yeah, but as a line, I think the triumph for science is already mitigated. The vaccines were a big triumph. I think no one expected them to be so fast, so quickly available, and so effective as they were at first. Now we're in a different situation. So, but what we discussed in the previous panel, I think science has also had to. I think a lot of scientists have had to eat a bit of humble pie. And I wanted to comment on what Nick was saying, what I saw. I mean, I do a lot of regulatory studies. It's really experts now have understood that it's not good enough to say, I'm the expert. You need to explain. That's why people listen to Fauci, because he's got a track record and he says it. He says, I've done this before. And at least it gives, you understand where the expertise lies, and people are not stupid. They can understand this. I think it was part of the undoing of Arruda as well, that people saw he was not in line with the other experts, and the other experts had the track record, and he didn't go in the same direction. So it was not just a problem of discrepancy between the political side and the expertise. It was a problem of people seeing that the expertise was not as good as it could have been. So when Failure for Humanity, I think, to connect on what Lisa was saying, is civil society has a central role to play in this. And for a lot of people, I think in the Western Hemisphere, this was a huge educational opportunity. People had no idea that these events could happen, except in the public health circles. So it's going to take some time, I think, for the population to put pressure for things to change to avoid that a repeated occurrence. And it came in terms of political timing and political cycles, the timing was as bad as it could have been, in the era of Trump and Johnson. The same thing could have happened 10 years before, you would have had a different response. And this is, you can't control for this. I think I always have hope, I think, but it's not going to happen in like some spectacular top-down gestures. That's what sometimes is despairing about climate change as well. It's a long slog, and it has to go from the bottom through civil society. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Pierre. And last comment before we close this session, Barbara?
Well, I think, as has been suggested, the triumph for science was around the vaccine. There were other real gaps, striking gaps. I mean, throughout the pandemic from the beginning, I was watching conversations from occupational hygienists who were saying, the government's just got this wrong, right? That these droplets don't just fall out of the sky, that we really have to be looking at ventilation. We really have to be looking at workplaces. And, they had clear expertise, and they've been proven to be right. That's the other thing. That we needed to address these issues. And there was a huge human cost as a consequence of that. Similarly, there were researchers who have been argued for a long time that things like the temporary foreign worker program, the housing situation for temporary foreign workers, and so on, was completely unacceptable. There was a regulatory gap there. The federal government wasn't getting involved in. And what the pandemic did, in a sense, was it drew attention to those things precisely because that housing actually ended up posing a threat, not only to temporary foreign workers, but to Canadians. But the government response in the first instance was to say, well, these people could be bringing in the disease, so therefore we have to quarantine them and take care of them, when in fact they ignored the fact that the temporary foreign workers could come in and get the disease from the community. So, I mean, I think it is highlighted, it's mobilized researchers in key areas such as those areas, again, public health officials standing up and saying, look, these workers in warehouses in Peel don't have access to vaccines. This fundamentally discriminatory in terms of who has access and who does not, and so public health officials were suddenly very aware of and very concerned about both the occupational and the public health aspects of this, because you couldn't take them apart, right? They're all fundamentally important, so I mean, I think we've seen amazing humanity. I think we've seen amazing vision and mobilization. The question is, how do we keep this going, I think, and how do we actually fundamentally address these issues?
Thank you very much to all of you. That was super interesting. It's just the beginning of the conversation, obviously. Someone suggested that we move forward with podcast. We'll see if we proceed with this. I think it's a good idea, but let's think about it. In any case, thank you again to all of you for this wonderful contribution. And so see you next time. I don't know if Jean-Louis have anything to say last few words, or Clara, but I think we're ready to close. Okay.
Well, thanks to all. It was very interesting to hear all the thoughts and conversation. So I hope we can replicate this kind of activities.
Thank you.